Microsoft just announced that GPT-4 is now available on Azure OpenAI. There are currently two models, GPT-4 and GPT-4 32K. The base GPT-4 model supports 8,192 tokens, and GPT-4 32K supports 32,768. To get access, existing customers do need to fill out a form to apply. At the same time, Microsoft has also released a new chat completion API. There are now two ways to interact with ChatGPT. The new chat completion API, which works for both ChatGPT and GPT-4 models, and the older completion API with ChatML, which only supports ChatGPT. Let's quick walk through some example code to get a sense of what this all means. So the first place I would recommend starting is actually at the new docs. This new how-to doc will give you a good understanding of kind of the difference between the chat completion API and the older completion API with ChatML. The main thing to understand is that the preferred path is to use the chat completion API. It's going to work for both ChatGPT and GPT-4, whereas the completion API with ChatML is only going to work with ChatGPT. There's also some additional work you have to do as far as handling input validation, and because ChatML is a lower level way of interacting with the API, there's more likelihood that it's going to change in the future, so all of this is outlined here. And for full disclosure, I'm one of the authors of this article. So we have a number of different code samples here. I've basically copied this and brought it over to here. The one thing I did change was the environment variable here, in that this is kind of the standard environment variable, and so on the environment I'm on, I switch back and forth between both connecting through OpenAI through Azure and also connecting to OpenAI directly, so I like having kind of segmented environment variables. So for my Azure stuff, I prefix it with Azure. We'll quick run this and then I'll explain what's happening. So if you've used the chat completion API that OpenAI offers, the first thing that it's good to be aware of is just one, normally you'd have model here. With Azure OpenAI, this is still engine. The other thing to understand here is this value here, when you're dealing with Azure OpenAI, is going to correspond to the deployment name. So in Azure OpenAI, you deploy each model and you choose a unique deployment name at that time. So in this case, I've chosen a deployment name that happens to match the internal Azure OpenAI name for this model. And another thing to understand is, while OpenAI, the model name is this, in Azure OpenAI, the model name is this. The dot or period character isn't supported in the names in the same way that it is for OpenAI. And so, but ultimately, this could be named my super cool model, though it doesn't support spaces, so I guess it would be my super cool model. Could be your deployment name in Azure if you wanted it to be, and then underneath that would be whatever model you've associated with it. For a lot of things, I tend to have a one-to-one relationship unless I have like a special fine-tuning model I'm creating. And we'll do GPT Turbo. The other thing to note is, compared to the old completions API, if you've used it with ChatML, or even if you used in the past, this parameter used to be prompt and it was passing a string of text. Now this parameter is passing an array of dictionaries, and the dictionaries have the text kind of organized in this chat style conversation. This is also the same expected style for your new GPT-4 model. So if I pick one of my GPT-4 models that I have deployed and I send the same question, we might get a slightly different response. We might get virtually the same response, but the thing to understand is you need to have this breakdown of the conversation. This article does a really good job of going through and kind of explaining how the different parts work with system role, how to think about this, how you can do in-context learning. I'm not going to go to that level of depth, jump to the end of this. So this is your basic call. You can also see that in choices, index 0 messages content, so where we actually store the response is slightly different than when you're using completions API versus when you're using the chat completion API. Let's go look at a more complicated example. So I'm going to open this up. This is just creating a basic chat loop. So we're going to take user input, create a little prompt that people can type into, We're going to change this so it is actually the model for, because we're talking to Azure OpenAI, not to OpenAI. And we'll run this. And so, ask a question. Question from movie Monty Python. Okay, so we get kind of a very straight answer. I am curious what I get. So we'll have to, because this is just a loop, it's going to keep accepting questions until we hit the token limit. So I'm going to just do a stop there. We'll change this and let's look at this with GPT-4 just to see. You get a much more in-depth answer, and it also picks up the fact that this is a famous question from Monty Python, the Holy Grail. And so we could keep asking questions. Okay, and so the last couple of things I want to quick show. This right here, and again, all the code we've seen so far you can get from the official docs. So this is some code I wrote, but it seemed like it would work well enough in the docs. This portion right here is from OpenAI. They do have slightly more in-depth code with error handling, so I do recommend taking a look at that if you are interested. But we'll go back to here. So what we're doing now is we still have our while loop and we're taking user input, but we have to be cognizant of the fact of we still, even with GPT-4, we do have a token limit. So GPT-4 can support 8K or 32K of tokens, but when you're talking to the model and having a chat conversation, you need to be repeatedly sending it the ever-expanding transcript of the conversation. So in order for it to have context of what you've asked previously and what it's answered previously, you need to stay under this token limit. So if you talk long enough, you will eventually get to that point where you're going to exceed this. There's kind of, there are a number of different strategies. One of the strategies is once you get to the point that you're going to be exceeding the token limit, to go and just delete the first item from the array and keep doing that continuously. We don't want to delete at index 0 because index 0 right now has our system message, which has kind of our extra instructions to the model. This is where you can tell it kind of how to behave. Do you want it to be polite? Any additional instructions goes there. The other strategy, and this is one that you see more with Bing, or Bing didn't employ this initially, but it appears to be doing something like this now, where you restrict conversation history to a specific number of turns. And so effectively what you're doing is you know more or less that this many turns in a conversation should result under a given token amount. And so once you reach that number of turns in the conversation, or once you know you've reached the token limit, rather than removing parts of the conversation history, just starting a brand new conversation. The reason that can be effective is if you use this method that I'm demonstrating here, where you're deleting part of the conversation history, as the conversation goes on, that conversation can really start to degrade because the model no longer knows the last 10 answers, the last 5 answers, the last however long, depending on how the conversation's going, that it gave, and the responses there, and the associated questions. And so it loses that coherence where you get that illusion as if you're talking to someone that remembers the entire conversation. If you're deleting that conversation out from the conversation history, you lose that starts to fall apart. So that's why there's those different techniques. So this will go and we'll quick run this, and you can ask it the same question. Again, we're using GPT-4. We do see a slightly different ordering of the response, so this is to some extent the fact that depending on the temperature value, you're certainly going to see some degree of variability in the responses. What I want to quick show you as well is it's very easy to take code like this and drop it into a Flask app. So this is more or less the code that we saw before. So right now this is looking at GPT-3 Turbo, so let's change this to GPT-4, and we'll give this a run. And so this just gives us our own little fun test interface to play around with. This obviously is not something you would ever deploy online in any way, shape, or form, but just if you want something that's a little nicer than Jupyter Notebooks. So we get our question over here, and then the response will generate over there. Oop. You can also see that my Flask app is not handling Jupyter Notebooks did a slightly better job of handling the list format that it returned back, so something that I can improve on that. And while this is going on, one of the nice things that I like occasionally of running things in Visual Studio, if we look here and let's go and technically for counting the number of tokens, we're using the encodings for GPT-3 Turbo. I need to double check and confirm if that is going to give you the same results for when you're using GPT-4, if that's actually going to give you an accurate count. OpenAI does have it set up such that you can provide it with the individual model name, so probably I should be changing this code to handle that rather than just having it hard-coded the way I do right now. But let's go and right here, let's create a breakpoint. And so I'll ask another question. We hit our breakpoint, and one of the nice things we can do is then look and be able to see kind of how our conversation array with the various dictionaries, how it's laid out. So you can see here in index 0, this is our system message. You can then see our first question, the response, our first question, the response. And so this is how it's going to keep playing this out. And then if we were to do this long enough until we hit our token limit, or if we wanted to, we could artificially restrict our token limit, you would then start to see these messages in index 1 get deleted out, just with how we've structured this right now, so that the conversation can keep going indefinitely. Is once we hit the token limit of 8,192 tokens, or whatever you arbitrarily set it to, then we'll start, if you look here, we'll start going and deleting conversation index 1. And so we'd start right here. That's all for now. If you like these videos, please do like and subscribe.